Hello and welcome back to Frankly Finance. So on today's episode, which is episode 14, we're going to be talking about investment properties in Australia. So, why people have them, what's the advantage to them, what are generally the issues and all of that kind of stuff. But before we get into it, for anybody that's in the chat or you're watching this later, Lexi and I were saying that we're kind of coming to an end of our ideas on what we can talk about each week. So we would love your ideas, your feedback on what you want to hear, because most of the best sessions that we've done have come from questions that people have asked for us to talk about. So if you have any, you could put in the chat now, or if you're watching it back, you can just send it into the Finito team and let them know what you want us to talk about in an episode. That would be amazing.
And I always say with my own clients, there's no point in me having a set agenda or things that I want to go through if it's not necessarily relevant to you or what you really want to focus on. So we could always come up with things to talk about, but we want to make sure we're hitting the mark of what you actually want to hear about, what's important to you, what your, challenges are, or things that you want to know more about as well.
Yeah, amazing. And there's some coming in the chat already, which is great. But yeah, I think we've talked about this before, Lexi. Like every time I do like a webinar or a presentation, sometimes I'm like, oh, nobody wants to know this, or this is boring, or it's too simple. Yeah. And most of the time it's not. That's actually what people want. But because we talk about it all day, every day, we just think people don't want to hear about that kind of stuff. So yeah, would absolutely love suggestions on what you want to hear. That's great. So on to investment properties. So this is one of my favorite topics. I think I actually say that like every week, right? I was like, superannuation is my favorite. And then last week with fire, I'm like, I love this topic.
You do say it a lot.
I just love talking about money.
Yeah, I totally get that, Gemma.
Okay, so investment properties. So I would say that most of the financial advisors, and we have got financial advice backgrounds, most of the advisors I've come across aren't huge fans of investment properties. And generally people are kind of like for shares and those types of investments or properties. Would you agree, Lexi? Where do you sit in that?
I wouldn't necessarily agree. I would say that the reason why they don't particularly like investment properties is because they can charge still a fee to give advice, but it goes back to how financial advice fees used to be charged, and it used to be, and it sometimes still is now, a percentage of an investment portfolio, and that doesn't include a property. So I know a lot of advisors who have investment properties themselves and are, advocates of investment properties, but I like to instead acknowledge that there are pros and cons to every type of investment. So there are certainly pros to investment properties, but there are also cons. So perhaps that's more that they're the bigger issues for advisors, that, perhaps something like shares or managed funds, that they don't have those same cons. So yeah. Does that answer your question?
I would definitely agree. And I think it's really hard as an advisor that has an opinion, can see the pros and cons and can see the bigger picture. I always find it challenging, especially with Australians, because they're so obsessed with property in general. Everybody tends to think, this is generalizing, of course, but people in Australia generally think the property is a good thing and that it doesn't go backwards, and it absolutely does. It's just that you're not getting valuations all the time, and you only tend to hear the success stories with property because people are willing to share them. It's rare that you actually hear the bad ones, but there are so many. We would have all heard examples about mining town booms and things, but generally you only hear positive stories about property, whereas shares, I feel that you generally hear horror stories about people losing their money and things.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's got a big thing to do with it as well, I think.
Imagine seeing your house price pop up on the news every morning to see like the change in value. Obviously, it's not something you can really articulate, but that to give you an idea, like you're seeing, if you do watch the news, I don't watch the news anymore, but if you used to turn on the TV when I was growing up, and all the shares are like, green arrows up, red arrows down. And so I think that if that was to happen for investment properties, we would actually see very similar patterns. Like I've looked before, because I've had clients that say, the volatility of property is different from the volatility of shares. And if you layer them on top of each other, at least in the graph that I was looking at, they track almost perfectly. So I think that it's like that barbecue discussion as well, isn't it? That everyone is going to talk about their great property stories. I know people personally who have properties worth less than what their mortgages are and in a bit of a pickle because they don't particularly want to sell when their mortgage is higher than their property value.
Yeah, exactly. Well, okay, so let's get into it. So what is an investment property? So an investment property, if for the purpose of this discussion, is a property that is not your principal place of residence. So you don't live in it or you don't holiday in it. It's a property that is designed for investments for you to make money out of. So some people will have second properties that, you know, the kids might live in for uni or they might holiday in and those types of things. That's totally different. I class them as lifestyle properties. There's a decision there to have that as a lifestyle asset that's not usually, you know, about wealth creation. So for this purpose, it's an investment property that you are not living in. So why would you have some? Why would you, you know, have an investment property? So generally it's for wealth accumulation. And I find that people have either strategically planned to have an investment property or they've been an accidental investor because they had a starter home first, they've outgrown it and they've moved into something else but just kept that one potentially.
I had that last week. A client, they tried to sell their home when they were moving, it didn't sell, so then they rented it.
Yeah, so you could be an accidental investor or you could be a strategic investor. The flip side of that, when people are getting older, they might buy the next house, so the smaller house, the townhouse or the ground floor unit or whatever. They're not ready to live in it just yet, so they might rent it out while they're still in their big home, but they know within, 5 years or so they might be downsizing. So I see that as also not so much a strategic wealth accumulation, but it's like, again, it's like a lifestyle asset. They're an accidental investor in property because they see that pathway. So they're the two kind of ways that I see that why people are in investment properties: strategically wanting to grow their wealth, or it just so happened that they're transitioning from a different kind of home.
Yeah.
So how do people get investment properties? So I've had a few different properties and I know you've built and you've sold and things. So usually most Australians kind of do a DIY approach, that they'll be working it out themselves, talking to real estate agents and that kind of thing. But becoming more and more popular, or at least in the circles that I am kind of talking to people in at the moment, is things like buyer's advocate, but buyer's agents. You can do the research for you. They can, get off-market deals. They can be talking to real estate agents and looking for things that potentially haven't come on the market yet, and kind of, you give them your list on all the things that you want, whether it's the home that you can live in or an investment property and what makes a great investment property, and they do all that due diligence for you. Have you had a lot to do with kind of buyer's agent?
I haven't used one myself. Like you mentioned, we built the property that we live in, and that was 10 years ago now. And so I don't feel like buyer's agents were necessarily a thing back then either.
I don't think they were either. I've only heard of them in recent years. I think it was just kind of like real estate agents that thought that they could do all of that analysis and stuff for you.
Yeah. So we've sold an investment property, but again, you're not looking for a buyer's agent when you're selling. So no, I haven't had a lot to do with them. I know a few, and I've heard some really, really positive stories out of that. I haven't heard any negative stories, but that's not to say there aren't any, just like with any kind of service, I guess.
Yeah, I know a couple and I've recommended a few people use them. Yeah, so I think I'm a bit of a fan, but also coming from a profession like financial advice, we know the importance of having a professional look at it and taking the emotion out of it and having the analysis and help, especially if it's going to be your first investment property, and taking that emotion out of it is so important. You want to look at what this property is going to be long term, and does it tick all the boxes that makes a great investment property. And potentially, especially with house prices at the moment, it might not be that you can buy in the area that you're in, that you could be looking at properties and know the area and know the agents. So if you're buying interstate or something, I think it's kind of like a no-brainer that you would utilize a specialist in one of those areas to do all the hard work for you. But yeah, I haven't heard any horror stories for buyer's agents. Obviously, with property courses and all of these types of things, you can pay a lot of money and not get results. So I think you've just got to be pretty careful with it and do your own research as well. But having somebody, so I think it's like when we talked about in a budgeting episode, like combining finances, you can outsource the work, but you can't outsource the understanding. So
Yeah.
yes, somebody can help you find the right property and tell you all the things about it, but you need to absolutely understand why you're looking at that strategy, what your strategy is. Like, are you looking for capital growth, or are you looking for a high income yield, like the rent that's coming in, what the strategy is and why you're going down that path.
So I think it's quite different to buying your own principal place of residence, because you want to come at, like, yes, you don't want it to be a bad financial decision, but you tend to come at that purchase from a more lifestyle point of view. So it's not necessarily about what the rental yield would be or anything like that. Whereas if you're buying a place purely for the sake of it being an investment property, it is a good idea to put a little bit more thought into it. Even simple things like spending money on renovations, you don't necessarily want to make it how you would want it, because that might not necessarily attract the market. So yeah, it's important to look at buying an investment property and buying your own property to live in as two kind of different processes, I guess.
Yeah, and I think this is why you want to know at the start what your strategy is. So say this is your first home, that's really, really exciting, right? But if you think realistically, I'm not going to be in this house forever, this is our first home, we're first home owners, we're getting into the market. I always talk to people about, yes, buy a home that you're going to enjoy living in, but buy something with an investment hat on that if you decide to rent this out in the future, it's going to make a great investment. Like, think long term about what this property could be for you. Will you be there 5 years, 10 years? Because you don't know if you're going to sell it to buy your next one. So if you buy something with an investment hat on that, yes, you can enjoy living there, you're not going to hate living there, but the masses are also going to be okay living there, then it's going to make a better rental than you buying, like a hot pink house that is like a little maze and nobody else would live there, but you love it being quirky. That's great if it's your forever home, but that's going to be hard to sell. It's going to be hard to rent. So you need to think about what this property is going to be for you in the next, 5-10 years, so that you can make sure that you're making smart decisions.
I think that this is probably not up to date at all, but I remember hearing a statistic that suggested that the average time that people live in a home is 7 years. Have you heard that?
Oh, really? I would probably think that.
Let me do a quick Google.
But then then you hear like stories about older people being in houses for like 40
It's the
years.
average, right? Because some people will be there for 6 months, other people will be there for 45 years. We've been here for 10 years.
10
You've
years
just moved. So
yeah, so I moved because I separated, but the family home Alex is still in, and we built that was going to be for our forever home. Like, and the one before that, I think we had for 10. So
I've got the
yeah.
stats. This is from RP data. So across Australia, the average length of time we stay in each property we own is 7.5 years for houses and 6.5 years for apartments.
What is it for renters? I wonder how long, because with renters you feel like you're kind of constantly moving up.
Australians tend to rent for 4.4 years on average. Gen Y renters move on average of 2.7 years. That was the survey. And I'm sure if you looked at a different survey, it would be slightly different, but
and it'd be based on demographics, like location and stuff as well, I would say. Because I remember there was like a time when I was living in Sydney, like nearly 20 years ago, and it felt like we were moving like every 6 months because people were selling houses and doing different stuff, which I think people would have felt that in COVID as well, when investment property owners saw their property prices going up and thought, well, let's sell. It would have been really, really unstable for all the renters at that time too. Okay, so, well, on that, buying and selling investment properties, the other thing to keep in mind if this is your investment decision to go down this path is, we're going to talk about the risks and the issues, but one of the big considerations is it's pretty costly in Australia to buy and sell properties. You know, you've got huge real estate agent fees, you've got stamp duty, conveyancing fees, which is the solicitors. I think on average it's always been about $2,000 every time that I've purchased, just for your lawyer fees. Yeah, and then your stamp duty. If you've got investment properties, you'll pay a higher stamp duty in most states than you would if you were going to live in the house. So buying and selling is really, really expensive in Australia. This is also why I talk to people about, before they buy even the first property, think about what it's going to be to you. Is it going to be a stepping stone property? Is it something that you can hold on to as an investment so you don't lose, you know, that cost of paying stamp duty, which might have been 20 or 30 grand, you know, to get into. So yeah, it's quite expensive. It's an expensive entry investment.
I find that stamp duty does trip a lot of people up. Like they do the numbers in their head and it all sounds really great, and then they forget to factor in stamp duty. I've just run a quick calculation for stamp duty in New South Wales on a property value of $850 for primary residence. The stamp duty is about $33,000. In Queensland, it would be about $24,000 for that property. Victoria would be 46,000. Let's not move to Victoria.
Wow.
Yeah, that's quite a big difference.
So Queensland was nearly half of Victoria's.
Yeah, so if I switch it to investment property for Victoria, it's the same actually for 46. I'll check Queensland again. Kind of annoying how everywhere has different.
Oh, I ran a webinar the other day, on like buying your first home, and I was trying to like talk about all of the different, you know, concessions and grants and things that you can get in each state, and all the different rules and the stamp duty, and it's so complicated. That's why talking to a broker and having a broker on your side that knows the state, and it's just so specific to each person.
In Queensland, on that little example that I ran, it was $7,000 more for stamp duty if it was an investment property. And I've seen cases, not for this, what was it? Oh no, it was stamp duty, where someone had bought a property and they were going to live in it, but then it was an investment property instead, but they paid stamp duty as if they bought it, were going to live in it. And so then they incurred this.
They had to pay back.
Yeah.
I've actually done the opposite of that. So we bought an investment property. So we paid investment property stamp duty, but then we moved into it. So I wrote to the Office of State Revenue and said, hey, we weren't going to live in this. Now we are.
Dear.
Hi guys. It totally worked. And I was like, here's the date we changed our licenses, and this is why we moved in, and this is why it changed. And they sent me a refund check, and it was like $7,000 or something. So it was a partial.
That is what I love about financial coaching. Not necessarily that we have many people in that particular scenario, but where this little thing that you can do, the one letter, the one phone call, the one simple change. We're not talking like about saving $20 here. We're talking about saving like in some cases $20,000. And if you don't know, you don't know. You don't know what you don't know.
Yeah. And sometimes it might be, so strategically, you might not be able to buy a property as an owner occupier, but you might be able to buy it as an investor, right? Because the lenders look at, well, then rental income's coming in, so it might be helping your salary. So the bank might say, no, you can't live in that property, but you can afford to buy it as an investor. So then your strategy might be, well, I'll buy it as an investment. That's totally fine. At some point, I'll move into it. Potentially then that strategy could work, that if you moved into it sooner, you'd paid the higher stamp duty because you bought it with the bank as an investment property, but your situation changed, then you could do something like write the letter. Yeah, so there's different things that you can do. But yeah, generally, because the bank will take into account that there's potentially going to be a renter in there and that they can contribute to the loan, the income and the cash flow of it, that you can potentially borrow a little bit more for investment properties if you're not going to live in it. And so we should probably talk about one thing that confuses everybody. I'm skirting around the issues that I don't like about investment properties because my list is so long. But let's just talk about quickly negative gearing versus positive cash flow, because I find that people get really, really confused about this. So you can have a property that is negatively geared. So on your tax return, it is helping you save tax because it's making a loss on paper. But it can actually be cash flow positive. So the rent can be covering the mortgage repayment. It's harder and harder to find these, but it's possible. So the rental income that you're getting can be the mortgage payments, the rates, the insurance, and all of your out expenses. So it could be just covering them, it could be giving you a little bit extra, or it could be a shortfall that you have to contribute to. So regardless of the cash flow analysis and what's actually happening with your cash and expenses, when you do your tax, this is why people love investment properties in Australia, is because you can still have all of the deductions that help get your actual, like your other income down, like your salary income down.
So things like depreciation on the furniture.
Non-cash deductible.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you can claim on, so how much the property costs to build, you can claim, I think it's 2.5% of the build cost over 40 years. So that has nothing to do with your rental income and your expenses on your home loan repayments.
I'm actually surprised by the amount of people that I've come across that have investment properties that don't have a depreciation schedule. Yes, they cost money, but the tax savings make a pretty big difference.
Yeah, so you go to companies and I had to get one the other day, and I think it was $250 or something, and I got it online and I just entered all the details in. I didn't even have to talk to anyone, put the year that it was built, put a couple of links, and then it was in my inbox for $250, and I won't have to do it. You don't have to ever do it again, right?
I think the one that we had lasted a certain, maybe it was like 7 years, but so you'd have to get one after that potentially. I don't know. We ended up selling, but yeah, good to know anyway.
And if you've got a good accountant and you've got an investment property, they should be helping you with all of these things, all of the things that are going to make it really easy for you to track the expenses throughout the year, really easy to make sure you're claiming the absolute maximums, and that, you know, all of the expenses that go with it, you know what you can claim and what you can't.
I'm starting to think we might need to do a part B, because as you just mentioned, we're talking about all the good things about investment properties, and there certainly are good things, but there's also some, I wouldn't say disadvantages, but some considerations that we might need actually more than 6 minutes to talk about.
Yes. So my major issue with investment properties, even though I love them and I have them as part of my wealth creation strategy, is that there's absolutely no diversification in it at all. Whereas your superannuation investment portfolio or your share portfolio, you've got generally lots of different companies in different sectors, in different, like, it's so well diversified. You can have different countries. They're going in the comments, I agree, definitely part B. But with an investment property, you are like putting all your hopes and dreams, your strategy on one state, one suburb, one street.
I was going to say one street.
It's so risky that you're just hoping that that is the one. And people generally, because of borrowing restraints, they don't tend to have as multiple investment properties that can diversify that a lot, like a share portfolio can.
And as you are also familiar with, buying in the same, like you're having your primary residence and your investment property in the same suburb, that's obviously even going to, what's the word I'm looking for? The opposite of diversify.
That is all your eggs in one basket. So the risky part. So up until recently, we bought, like, our family home was on a cul-de-sac that we loved so much, but we were outgrowing our family home. So we bought across the road, like a 2-story, and that's the forever home that we renovated and built on and stuff. Yeah, so we at one point had 2 houses in one state, in one street. And I was just like, as a financial advisor who likes to diversify, was just like, oh, this is really, really stressful. Whereas everyone else is, oh, this is great because you can see the other property, you can see what the tenants are doing. And I'm like, no, for the sake of diversification, this is very, very risky. Like,
yeah. And it is, like, I completely appreciate that you probably know the area very well and that you can go and check on it if you don't want to use a property manager.
There's lots of benefits, but you also have no idea really what's going to happen. Like, so for example, we sold it just before COVID because I was like, oh, we've already got one in the street and let's diversify. And then COVID happened and we were like, oh, wow, that was really lucky that we sold that because property prices will all go down likely. Like, you know, how we were all thinking that this was like, you know, the end of investments and the next GFC, and everything went up instead. So yes, it would have been handy with hindsight to have kept that property, but that kind of happened, you know, everywhere regardless. And you absolutely never know. But yeah, so
My
that is
crystal ball is in the shop still, and they say they just can't fix it.
The what?
My crystal ball, it's broken.
Oh.
I got that joke from an advisor who I thought was
Do you
very
know what I
funny.
saw the other day? Do you remember those 8-ball, those black, like,
Yeah.
8-balls, and you would shake it and you would ask it a question? It was like
We
on
should
a reel
get
or
one.
something. Yeah, we should get one of
Yeah,
them.
buy
That would
one.
be. Yeah, can you get one? And then we can
Yeah.
make all our decisions based on that. All right, well, this is actually really handy that we've run out of time because now we have a topic to talk about next week. So we
Yes.
can go through the disadvantages and maybe just a little bit more around like the tax on it, because we touched on the negative gearing, but we can go through a bit more on the tax. And I have a heap of facts because I know how much Lexi loves facts.
Oh, I love them.
So I thought I would get the facts on investment ownership. So I've got those to go through as well. So we can do that next week.
Okay.
And then put them together.
And the flow-on effect of all these things, like we talk about tax, but something that I think is really important, especially for young families, is potentially the impact on childcare fees as well, which some people don't necessarily consider. But we can talk about that next week.
Yeah, and that's a consideration when you've got like the income coming in, but also when you're going to sell it. So that's a big consideration. Excellent. Well, this just took one less thing we have to think of during the week, our topic. So that's exciting. And then thank you to the people in the chat that put their suggestions in on other things that they want us to talk about. And if you're watching this, as I said, as a recording, just shoot an email through or make a comment on the video so we can see what other topics that you'd like to see in future episodes.
Cool. See you next week.
Right. See ya.
Bye.